Hi, I'm Jake Kouns, CEO of Risk-Based Security. Welcome to this edition of The Right Security, the show which we spend time talking with leaders and veterans in the security space, tackling the issues of the day. Hello, today I'm joined by Deana Shick. Deana specializes in vulnerability management, vulnerability response, and threat intelligence. She's newly a PSIRT engineer at Intel Corporation. Prior to that, she had a role as the PSIRT Lead at Rockwell Automation. But Deana, where we met for the first time, if you remember, we were actually landing in Japan off of a long flight in Narita as we were both flying over to the first conference. And at that time, and I think for 6 years, you were a member of the technical staff at the CERT Division at the Software Engineering Institute, right? And while in your role, Deana was involved in quite a few projects, too many to list, but some that were, really caught my attention was the Vulnerability Disclosure Program with the Department of Defense, Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure Guideline for the DoD, and then you were also, Deana also coordinated and developed responses for security standards with like CVE, CVSS, all those sorts of things. But today, Deana, as you can imagine, what do I want to talk about? Vulnerabilities, of course. So many things we could cover, but I figured, why don't we talk a little bit about maybe a little risk-based vulnerability management in the real world and some vulnerability coordination. So welcome. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Jake. It's great to be here. I was going to say it's great to have you too, but that doesn't make any sense. You know what's super funny? My favorite story to tell people is how you and I met, because what Jake had left out is that we were on a very long flight, but Jake was sitting like several rows behind my boss at the time. And all of a sudden I see this man run up to my boss and like put a sticker on his laptop. And I was like, who's this guy? And then I met him in Malaysia shortly after
that. Oh, man. Those are some really interesting times to think about, given the world we live in right now. Like, when will the next time we be on an airplane? Who knows?
I know.
But let's jump in. So, at Risk-Based Security, we're hard at work on our year-end VulnDB quick view report. Some quick sort of things that our VulnDB team aggregated over 23,000 vulnerabilities in 2020. Over 6,600 were missed by CVE and NVD. We're kind of up on 80,000 vulns that they've missed all time, if anyone cares about such things as that. And we've already published over 200 vulns in 2020, so there's obviously no risk or no rest for the coming out of 2020 into 21. I think many of us were hoping to get 2020 behind us, but 21 after 6-7 days is off to a rough start more than one way, and not just cybersecurity. So when we did first meet, it was a lot about CVSS. So I figured let's start there. Okay. So in your CERT role, you were pretty formally involved in the CVSS SIG. And here's where I want to go with this question. Now that you've been in, let's call it the real world, after you moved on from your CERT role, what are your thoughts on CVSS V2 and V3?
Oh, man. So I will give a bit of a disclaimer that I have not been involved in CVSS in the way that I used to when I was at CERT. However, now being in the real world and at two very large companies, I think I've really seen some of the reasons why we created SSVC when I was at CERT in the first place. So a lot of companies, especially smaller companies or those in like non-traditional IT markets, are still very much struggling with how to do vulnerability prioritization. While CVSS claims and says on their website that you should not use CVSS as a prioritization method by itself, I think some folks are still doing that. One of our big wins when I was at CERT was to have the language be changed to say, please do not use CVSS by itself as a standalone thing in order for you to do vulnerability prioritization. So now that I am, on the other side of the fence, it's even more important because a lot of folks struggle with that prioritization problem. And I think the microscope is being put on SSVC as a good secondary solution, especially for ICS, which is where I came from prior to this role.
Awesome. And I'll definitely ask you some questions about SSVC here in a second. But if we keep our focus on CVSS, because so many of our listeners, that honestly is what they know from using vulnerability, when they're trying to do vulnerability management. Have you seen, again, I don't want you to disclose too much, and get you in any trouble at your jobs, but have you, being on the side where you were trying to more, let's call it academically, figure out what the standard should be, how it should work, coordinating that and getting buy-in from a whole bunch of different vendors, even to the funny debates and spirited debates about how math should work to score things. That was something that you spent a lot of time on, right? And now, regardless whether CVSS, how it should be used, a lot of people tend to try to use it as a prioritization method. And in some ways I get it, right? If you have a million vulnerabilities dropped on your lap, you're trying to bucket those. And so have you seen, when you've gone into organizations and you start talking about this, are they already aware of CVSS? Are you bringing it up? Is there any difference that you feel about CVSS now that you're in that practitioner role?
So when I was at CERT, I think I had a little bit more visibility into what folks were doing. So from my perspective, I've worked with companies that have had like a vulnerability management capability, at least for a couple years. So they are aware of CVSS. Now, when I walk in, like in my past role, I had walked into Rockwell and I came right off the heels of helping to write SSVC and all of that great stuff. So they really gave me the latitude to try and encourage SSVC across the industry prior to me leaving and heading to Intel, which I really appreciated. My opinion on CVSS remains the same. However, I understand the importance because prior to SSVC, there really wasn't a good alternative. And don't get me wrong, SSVC is great, but it also is a work in progress as well. So from an industry perspective, in order to make these vulnerability prioritization efforts worth it, providing any sort of feedback back into SSVC is super important to see what works and what doesn't, because ultimately the academics over at the CERT Coordination Center want to get it right. They want it to be actionable to be used by other companies. So there are some tweaks that I think that should be made there, and in many discussions still with CERT Coordination Center. Now, going back to CVSS, I, as you know, Jake, still very much am not super happy with the math and some of the other things, though I think I have a bigger appreciation for all of the work that had gone into creating CVSS, now seeing how industry uses it and all of the big minds that came together to try and create something.
Well, that makes total sense. And we've discussed quite a bit about CVSS. So I love asking these questions when I kind of know where you're going to answer. Right?
As you know, I don't think it's any secret that I'm a bit of a CVSS hater, only because I want to see it be the best that it can be, or have it fit its actual use case. So people have told me in the past when I was at Rockwell and other places that I've been like the bad news fairy when you deliver a particular CVSS score to something. So I get it. It's important for that sort of communication, but I just want it to be the best that it could be for its use case.
Hey, I appreciate that, because I've been accused of that, as you know, and you've seen it when I've been sitting in a room asking questions from our analysis, right? But I do have a throwback for you. So, you are right that, a lot of people have, even still do, let's be honest, use CVSS as a prioritization aspect, right? And, there was start to be a mission of its severity scoring only, nothing with prioritization, nothing with risk. And again, companies still use it this way, but do you remember sitting in the room at the SIG when they passed out these golf balls?
The golf balls?
I don't know if I can. Do you remember these little golf balls? And for those that
Yes.
can't see if they're watching, it says there's no risk in using CVSS, right? And that was a sort of a big moment, joking, but it was trying to say, hey, CVSS is a standard, has a purpose, and you shouldn't be using it wrong, right? But in fact, organizations are still using it wrong. So
Yeah.
do you, if someone says to you, you know, we need to start doing risk-based vulnerability management. What does that mean? And what do you think about that?
So, okay. So taking it from a perspective of CVSS, right? Like it's super easy for organizations, especially when you have a strapped IT staff that's, trying to understand this huge mountain of vulnerabilities that they have to deal with, right? When it comes to risk, though, I mean, risk is an equation that has to take in several different aspects in order for you to understand like what the risk is to you or your organization or to your assets, right? So CVSS can be a part of that decision, but risk decisions in general, kind of vary from organization to organization because your processes, your controls, your assets are all different. So making sure that you're using multiple data points to confirm or help you make that decision is how I view risk-based security. And it's different just because every organization is different, just like every human is different. But the key is to not rely on a single metric in order for you to make that determination. It's about combining a bunch of data to help you in that decision making.
So I think we both know that CVSS v4 is in active development. I've been following the best I can on the mailing list, and I'm not sure how much you're still involved these days, but it's interesting if you see some of the developments. It looks like they're starting to bring in threat metrics, and maybe that golf ball might not be as valid anymore. So, do you have any thoughts on? Again, I know there's alternative approaches, but do you have any thoughts on if you're waving the magic wand, what V4 can potentially do to help a practitioner?
So I will tell you, I have not been involved in the CVSS SIG since I had left the CERT Coordination Center, like 14, 15 months ago. So at this point, I know it's shocking for you, but I actually can't speak to what's happening right now going on in the CVSS SIG. But maybe if you have me on for another one of these, we can have more conversations about that. I am hoping within my new role at Intel to get back involved with the first SIGs because I do think that there's a lot of really good work to be done, but I'm not sure what the CVSS SIG is doing for version 4.
All right, sounds good. All right, we're finally going to get to what may be your favorite topic. 2019 in December, you were part of the team that published that paper called the Stakeholder Specific Vulnerability Categorization, otherwise known as SSVC. Now, we did have Art Mannion on recently, and he shared a recap and some details about it. So, in the show notes for those folks that didn't catch that, we'll put a link to it and whatnot. But I'd love to hear a little bit more. You touched on it a bit, but a little bit more on your thoughts on SSVC, sort of, what sparked it a bit. But again, now in your new roles, anything you can share with us about how you've been able to put that into your PSIRT role, use that with conversation with exec, anything that's a little more great. There's this thing and it should help you. But how have you been able to, or how do you hopefully plan to maybe use it a little bit?
That's a great question, and this is my favorite topic. So, I was one of the authors on SSVC, and it's still one of the prouder things that I've worked on in my career. And I will say, so when we were creating SSVC, at that point, we were trying to understand how vulnerability management was happening, both from a PSIRT perspective and from a defense or a patch applier perspective. So when you walk into a new organization and you have this great idea like SSVC, what has worked for me is kind of like baby stepping people through the process, and kind of showing why CVSS was giving the gap areas that it was, right? Like the gap areas in that decision making. So there are a couple of things here. So what's worked for me is I haven't had the opportunity yet to run any vulnerabilities that I've been responsible for through the decision tree. But I some of the points in those decision trees have really helped me to kind of conceptualize and communicate the risk or prioritization as I saw it especially when I was the PSIRT lead. So, for example, one of the things that we take for granted a lot of the time is understanding the exploit or like the proof of concept, right? So sometimes when you are in a new organization or an organization that is at the beginning of its security program or like halfway through that hasn't quite hit that super mature mark, folks don't understand or don't know yet that if there's an active exploit in the wild, that should bump up your prioritization. That seems really basic for folks like me or you, Jake, but I think showing that there's a vulnerability and there's an active exploit are two things that really resonate with people. They're like, oh my gosh, like, okay, I really need to prioritize this A, B, C, and D. And that is one of the characteristics of SSVC, especially from like a PSIRT or a patch developer perspective. So parts of SSVC, we spent a year and some to figure out what categorization method was going to be. Some of them fit a PSIRT or patch developer use case perfectly. Some other ones are going through like some work, but the idea of trying to understand your product portfolio and what the impacts are if there was a vulnerability in it, even bringing in some like safety components and ideas into SSVC gets other people talking about those sorts of implications too. So I know that was fairly long-winded about my favorite topic, but baby stepping your way when you walk into a new organization, when you have a different prioritization method is really important, but also just using SSVC as a communications tool to help you with vulnerability prioritization is just as helpful as probably running through the tree, at least for me.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the work that you guys did on SSVC. I'm looking forward to hopefully it being more used.
Yeah, it's not perfect by any means, and that was the whole idea, was to at least create a framework so you can adjust as needed. And that's kind of the situation that the CERT Coordination Center finds itself in. So the more that I can help them spread the word about SSVC, I think we as a community are better off, because then that standard can be changed. Well, when it becomes a standard, of course.
All right. We'll definitely talk more about SSVC, and we'll link to it for everyone. Try to get it out there for you for sure. But now let's move on a little bit. Let's talk about disclosure a little bit. So when you hear the acronym CVD, Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure, from your perspective, you think you can give listeners some thoughts on what the heck that is, and then the value of vulnerability coordination?
Yeah, so CVD is not so coordinated vulnerability disclosure, CVD isn't like a set of like a point in time that you practice CVD. PSIRTs and product security incident response teams and third-party coordinators practice CVD every single day. So the idea is for organizations to be able to receive vulnerability reports, work with vulnerability researchers or coordinators to understand the vulnerability and ultimately fix their products. And the idea is that once a vulnerability has been mitigated, whether just your product or your product downstream in your supply chain, then you can disclose that to the public and to your customers to let them know, A, to apply a mitigation, but B, it also shows that your organization really is putting its money where its mouth is in terms of vulnerability management and all of that great stuff. So when you're involved in coordinated vulnerability disclosure, biggest piece of advice for anybody that's starting a PSIRT or at the beginning stages of a PSIRT is that researchers, reporters, third-party coordinators are your friend. They ultimately want you to fix something before an adversary has the opportunity to exploit it for their own benefit. It ultimately makes your products better and your customers happier, even though it's really scary to see the word vulnerability. It can be kind of touchy for certain folks that may not always be in the PSIRT space or always be in the coordinator space. But it is like an ideal that you try and work towards. Where CVD gets hairy is that you're dealing with people. So people are the most complicated part. So having clear and concise communications and consistent communications are going to always be your friend. But where things get extremely complicated is when you're dealing with a multi-party coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So that could mean that your product is in a supply chain of, 2 hops up in a different product. And how do you coordinate with hundreds of companies, for example, something that is it's extremely difficult. And on paper, you're like, oh, this probably isn't, too hard. And when it comes to multi-party CVD, like it can really get out of control if you don't have a good mindset of or a framework to work in when dealing with those sorts of cases.
Now, I don't know if I'm going to put you on the spot here, and you can just kind of smile and nod with this one. But again, one of the things that caught my attention was some of the work that you did for the DoD, or part of that team, creating their guide, right? Their coordinated vulnerability disclosure guide. Are there any learnings about that involvement, or any thoughts that you can share with people that want to know more about this, or thinking about they need to get involved or create their own guide?
So when it came, so I will tell you, when I was involved in the DoD stuff, that was back in 2015. So my memory is a little fuzzy on some of the pitfalls, and so I don't feel comfortable necessarily discussing that just because it's been a long time. But the CERT Coordination Center out of Carnegie Mellon University was the first to even start coordinating vulnerabilities in the public space since 1988. That's when they began doing it. So they really were like the first. And they have created a coordinated vulnerability disclosure guide that's publicly available on their website. Other resources that are very helpful if you're trying to understand CVD or trying to conceptualize some of what's discussed in that guide, you can check out there's a bunch of information out of FIRST, both I think in the vulnerability coordination SIG and the PSIRT SIG, that can help, especially when it comes to multi-party CVD. When you're beginning to create a PSIRT or kind of diving into that, other good resources to understand CVD and like common pitfalls, or even like the how-to documents, is looking at the ISO 29147 and 30111 documentation, which a lot of us use, trying to improve upon every day within our roles. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I answered it well.
No, it's great. So I think that's super helpful, and we'll try to again link in some of the notes to some of these things. There's been a lot of work in this space, and I think people are still trying to get their heads around it, though, unfortunately. So what do you say to the researchers out there if they go, the CV coordinated stuff doesn't make any sense, or you have any thoughts when researchers feel frustrated that coordination only makes sense when it's the company that has the problem trying to coordinate?
This is a really good, I feel like I could probably spend like another hour just discussing this topic. And my perspective is, I think, probably considerably different, because I like grew up in the CERT Coordination Center and like really lived that like culture, So when working with researchers, I always just try and remind folks that these are human beings that have motivations to do something. And you can have varying motivations. Some folks are motivated by money. Some of them are motivated just by doing like good deeds, right? And then some folks, you know, you might not have a zone of possible agreement with them. Because humans are difficult and communication is difficult. And sometimes, you know, you might not feel like you can come together on a disclosure date or something like that. I love working with the research community. I think that a lot of PSIRTs should really value that. And a lot of them do. But just always remember that these are human beings that are some of them are ultimately trying to make your product better, and to just be grateful for that experience. In the event that somebody decides to not engage in coordinated vulnerability disclosure and they just drop 0 days on Twitter, my biggest piece of advice is to have a plan if that were to happen. And then always, there's no harm in trying to engage, and just remember that that person is another human being. I think we lose sight of that. I think sometimes people think that researchers are like robots or something else, but ultimately we're kind of driving towards the same thing. So I've been lucky enough, knock on wood, to have had great experiences working in the research community. So I have nothing bad to say. I just hope that folks can engage. That's really the long and short of it. Just treat people like human beings.
So maybe you can help some listeners that get confused by some of these acronyms, right? We have CVD, and you know, we call that Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure. And then we have VDP, Vulnerability Disclosure Program. What's the difference between a VDP and a CVD?
So coordinated vulnerability disclosure is like from a vendor perspective, you know, your goal to try and fix the vulnerabilities in your products and disclose them to the public, which I realize is also very scary for some organizations. But trust me, like, you know, when you're going through this process, the disclosure phase of telling your customers and the public that you have a vulnerability is actually extremely important. It builds a lot of really good will. Anyway, so CVD is kind of like the overall, like how you want to engage. A CVE, CVE, the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures Program, is run out of the MITRE Corporation and supported by the Department of Homeland Security. And the CVE program, Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures Program, is meant to put an identification number to publicly disclosed vulnerabilities so that you're able to track them. CVE IDs become extremely important when you're looking at your supply chain, or if I can throw a wrench into this, if you are coming from even a threat intelligence perspective. So if you are performing threat intelligence, for example, and you're trying to understand if the adversary group that you're tracking is using a particular vulnerability that's been disclosed, typically you look at the CVE ID to try and understand the vulnerability details and any mitigation details that'll go into that. So the CVE ID is like, I think I can't remember the way that people describe it, but you should kind of think of it just as the identification number that you would use to go look up more vulnerability information. Vulnerability disclosure programs, in my experience, and I worked with the DoD VDP PAC in 2015, and I've heard that word thrown around, but it's ultimately to encourage researchers, again, to disclose vulnerabilities that they find to you so you can ultimately fix them. When it comes to that particular VDP, when I was working on that, the scope was, and I believe still is, like very tightly scoped. So it's less in terms of product security and more on like IT security. Though, like I said, when it comes to VDP stuff, you know, I haven't played around all that much into certain programs, especially when it comes to DoD.
Yeah, lots of acronyms in our world. VDP, CVD, CVE, CVSS. You know, it can be it can be a lot, especially for people trying to figure out what all those things are. And some people use all that interchangeably when it's not really meant to be, interchangeable. But
Yeah.
all right, so moving from disclosure stuff and trying to tie it together with prioritization and the real world and all that. 2020 was a really tough year for lots of reasons, but I think, we dubbed that thing the vulnerability Fujiwara, where, we saw Microsoft and Oracle, collide, right? And it was leading to anywhere between 600 to like 800 plus vulnerabilities being dropped on organizations all on one day. So I want to get your thoughts here again, as you've moved into the side that things are getting dropped on, and maybe not some of the behind the scenes that what's being coordinated and might be coming. So do you think it's helpful that vendors have kind of all piggybacked on Microsoft Patch Tuesday, and now organizations are seeing these common disclosure dates?
I will tell you, I think everybody gets a little nervous every Patch Tuesday. And I think it probably could be information overload for some organizations. I mean, so just for what it's worth, everything that I'm discussing is based off of my background almost up until working at Intel, because I've only been there for a couple weeks. But I can imagine that especially from a vulnerability defense perspective, you have, thousands of vulnerabilities hitting you at any given time. And you're like, okay, well, how do I prioritize these patches? What goes first, what goes second, especially if you're working in an organization that has millions of endpoints. That problem is very real. But I don't think I have a good answer for you on this exact topic. I just can imagine that it's tough. And I'm not sure which way our community is going to go on that either.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting debate about too much all at one time versus spread out, consistent. But
Well,
it's
so
from a volume standpoint, it's tough.
Right. So from an ICS perspective, and ICS is much different. But when I went to Rockwell, I'll never forget, like, one of my folks in my management chain had said, in order to apply these mitigations, it would have to take whatever plant offline for X amount of minutes. Each minute costs you Y amount of dollars, which could be in the thousands. So especially when it comes to like ICS, I think that they want those bundles so they can shut down plants and manufacturing things all at once in order to apply everything. Whether that works in IT environments or not, it's kind of, I think it probably varies on what people prefer. Not, like you said, there's a debate around it, but I can see putting out a lot of things on Patch Tuesday might be beneficial for those folks that when you're actually applying those patches, you can do it all at once. Whether that's the right thing to do or, you're maximizing anything, I don't know, but that's one of those things that ring in my head, having come out of a company that was dealing with ICS for so long, that there are some real considerations for those network defense folks, especially when you're dealing with, that cyber physical aspect.
All right. So as we're getting into the home stretch here, at RVA Sec in 2019, you helped spearhead and run our first 101 track. I got to tell you, it was so well done. It was really brutal not having an RVA Sec in 2020, and makes my eye twitch a little bit here that still a lot of things are up in the air for this coming year. But when you think about folks that are still young in their security journey, right? And then we're learning and love the one-on-one track that was put together. In the current environment where we're still all kind of locked down and virtual and conferences aren't much of a thing, hopefully everyone has watched the one-on-one track on the RVA Sec YouTube channel, and we'll put links in there to that. But do you have any recommendations or thoughts that are still trying to continue their learning when we're kind of in this virtual, isolated world right now?
Yeah, it's really tough. So Thank you for those great compliments because I loved doing the 101 track at RVASec. It is, and I'm not saying this because you're right here, but it truly is one of my favorite conferences. Like I can't wait for it to come back. But in any case, so I teach, so I'm an adjunct at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, and I've also taught at Carnegie Mellon University in the Heinz College. So I watched my students who were taking my intro class like really struggle to transition from being on ground to like fully online. So what I told them is, we should, it's so tough, but there are a lot of different virtual conferences going on, and a lot of times those things are communicated to the community via Twitter. So as much as I love and hate InfoSec Twitter, if you start following some of the hashtags or what have you, you can find places to either listen in or join into a conversation or a happy hour, because there are all of these groups that are popping up to try and, fix this problem, so to speak, or try and encourage people to continue learning. So there are also a bunch of free, available trainings that people can do as well. I always refer even my undergrad and graduate students to YouTube University if you want to learn something, because thankfully our field is based on the internet, and the internet is for all, for everybody to understand how it works. So there are a lot of different YouTube videos for you to understand the different intricacies and what have you. I found myself in all of these new Slack channels and in all of these new Signal groups and things like that. So if there are new people that are trying to get into the field and they've been beaten down by 2020, just like everybody else, everybody is welcome to reach out to me, and I can talk you through different resources that I find important or helpful, just because I know that this is a really tough time for everybody. So if I can even be, helpful in that way, I'm happy to do it. But don't be afraid. 2021 is off to kind of a crazy start, but there are still really good people in the field that you can learn from, and a lot of good online resources too. So.
All right, so my final question for you. There's still a lot of people that are looking to get into security that aren't sure where to start because there's so many disciplines and so many things, and should they be the red team or the blue team or the purple team or all these sorts of things, right? And one of the things that I will say conferences were good for were getting folks an opportunity to sort of have a crash course, talk to a lot of different people, see a lot of different talks, and start to feel like where they're gravitating towards, what thing they might like to do or might be a good fit for them. Do you have any thoughts for someone that may be watching this now going, I really want to get into security, I just don't know what I should watch or what I should train on? How do they figure out what's a good fit for them or what might they like to do?
So my mom always told me, and I tell people this all of the time, is that you don't know what you like until you know what you don't like. So if I were starting in information security, I would try and, if you have a topic that you think you might like or buzzwords that you've heard, just start going off and trying to learn about them. Udemy and organizations like that offer like some very low cost classes. There's also just a lot of, I think a lot of folks like to put a flag in the sand and say like, this is red team and this is penetration testing and this is whatever, when in reality, like the skills needed for those, kind of traverse those bins that we're putting them into. So if I were trying to get into the field today and I've heard some buzzwords or things that I know that I might want to look into, start looking into them. And if you wind up learning that you hate that particular subject matter, then move on to a different subject matter that might be more beneficial for you. But I don't think you can start doing that until you start doing a little bit of investigative work too. I deeply miss conferences because I am a people person, I am an extrovert, and I miss like seeing people, because I think a lot of good work gets done face to face, or like you're at a conference and you go to a hotel bar and then all of a sudden a new program is created that you never would have even thought before. So for new people, don't fret, that's going to be coming back, but you don't know what you like until you know what you don't like. So trying to explore what those topics are is probably the most beneficial thing that I would recommend. It's tough right now, but hopefully things look up for 2021.
I think that's some great advice for people listening. All right. Well, there we have it. Deana, I really appreciate you taking the time, sharing your thoughts and your talents with everyone. Stay safe, and I look forward to meeting up with you maybe mid-air on a flight or landing in some random airport at a conference sometime in the future.
Well, thanks for having me, Jake. I want you to know, though, you and I have been to Asia together. We've been to Europe together. I've seen you in the US. Like, I feel like we probably need to go to South America at some point for a conference and just, run into each other there.
I'm ready. I'm ready.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks again. Talk to you
All
soon.
right. Okay.